let's talk about something super important in photography and filmmaking: dynamic range. Dynamic range is how far the brightest portions of your image can vary from the darkest portions of your image and still hold detail. Now there's two types of dynamic range that you need to worry about. The first one is the dynamic range of a subject, which is how much contrast exists within a scene. And then there's the dynamic range of your camera, which is how much contrast that your camera can actually capture. So why is this important? Imagine you're in a dark room on a sunny day. Everything inside the room you can see even in the shadows, but outside the window, the outside world is completely white and blown out. Now imagine you put sunglasses on. Now all of a sudden, everything through the window is visible. You can see the trees in the sky, but everything inside of the room is totally dark and you can't make out any detail. Now this is exactly what your camera goes through in a high dynamic range scene when it's trying to capture both ends of that contrast. It forces you to have to choose to expose for the highlights or the shadows. You might hear someone say, well, this camera has 12 stops of dynamic range. Well, what does that mean? To understand what that means, first we need to understand what a stop actually is. A stop is just a unit used to measure light. Increasing by one stop means that you're effectively doubling the amount of light entering your camera sensor or within a scene. If you decrease by one stop, you're halving the light hitting your camera sensor or within a scene. So if a camera has 12 stops of dynamic range, it can record 12 levels of that brightness throughout that range, from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights and everything in between. But if the scene has more contrast than that, the camera can't hold all that detail. So anything outside of both ends of that spectrum is going to be what's called clipped. It's basically data that your sensor can't actually see, so none of that is going to be recoverable in post. Understanding this helps you make smarter exposure choices and use dynamic range creatively. One of the great things about photography and filmmaking is that you have choice, and ultimately, those choices affect the mood, emotion, and context of an image. Let me show you an example. Here's a shot where I expose for the highlights and let the shadows fall into black. The result is moody and dramatic. Now, here's the same scene, but I expose for the shadows. It feels softer, brighter, maybe even more hopeful. Same camera, same moment, but a totally different emotion, just based on which end of that dynamic range I expose for. This can be the difference between a good image and a great one. So yeah, having a camera with more dynamic range is almost always a plus. But gear isn't everything. You, as a creator, need to understand your tools, know their limitations, and use those limitations to make intentional, artistic decisions. I hope that made sense, and I hope you picked up one more tool to help you with creating show-stopping images. If you don't know who I am, my name is Juan Jaiman. I'm a photographer and videographer, and I make videos about all the things that go into creating content and making a living through visual storytelling. If you have similar interests to me, I'd love for you to come back and watch some more of my videos. All right, thanks for watching. Peace.